Okay, so today we're going to go through the source reference template. Now you could use the template, this one that I'm going through today, and use the information that I'm giving you, or you could use this information and apply it to a template that you've designed yourself. Whichever you do, if you create your own reference template, you should really have a lot of the same aspects to it, just to ensure that your source analysis is really thorough and is going to be useful to you as a source analysis. All right, so we will start by looking at the referencing aspect of it. Now, I think that if you do this Harvard referencing now at this point, it's going to save you a lot of time at the end. Referencing in itself can be quite lengthy and time consuming. So if you are creating those references as you go, then it's going to save you a lot of time when it comes to your outcome. You might use upwards of 20-30 sources, and so if you've got those all there ready to go, it's a matter of copying and pasting them into your reference list. I will say though that it's really important if you're using a citation device online that you are aware of how the referencing actually works. So you should still read the referencing guidelines and have a good understanding. A citation generator is really much like a calculator in maths, in that you do have to understand the maths that you're using to have that tool be useful to you. One of the other important things is that the generators will often put a date in automatically for you, and it will be the year that you are currently in. So let's say you're reading a blog post from 2016 from a website. If you use the URL on a referencing generator, it will put in 2018, even though that was published in 2016. So it is important that you do check the details that it puts in when it's automatically generated, and that you manually change those where necessary so that it is accurate. Okay, the research process is very simple. That's going to be whether it's an interview, a survey, a literature review, whatever your process might be. I think it's useful to put further details in brackets. So as I've got here, it's a book. It might be, you might have multiple interviews, and so you might distinguish between them in some way, or surveys and so on. Credibility, that is really very important to address. And in the first instance, it tells me how much you've assessed this source prior to reading it. Because the first thing that you need to do in looking at sources is to establish that that has been created by somebody who has some credibility, who really does know what they're talking about and has the ability to give you information. So making a comment there on the credibility of the source is really important, and that's the same as if it might be an experiment or a data set for an observational survey or so on. So you will say why that particular group that's been chosen is going to be credible. Key findings. This will vary in length, and some sources will give you a very small amount of key findings, and others a very large amount. That doesn't necessarily make them any more or less important to your research, because one source that gives you a very small finding may be critical in actually pinning everything together in your research. So having more or less there isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. But what it should show is that if you've read that article and you had to sum up in a few key points, what were the key points that were important to your research in that document. Now, the key point there is important to your research. So if I was reading a document for my research question, which was different to your research question, but are within the same area, we may take different key findings out of that source. So it is important to note that it's not a general recount of the source, it's the key points of information that are relevant to you that you've found in that document. The document that this particular template example is based on is the Lorax written by Dr. Seuss. It's a children's story. And so for this particular example. The key finding there is quite short, but it's useful in other ways, and we'll see that as we go through. So upon reading this book, I thought that I needed to find a little bit more information about Dr. Seuss and about the Lorax itself, and so I've started with some Wikipedia articles. Now, I will note there that Wikipedia is not particularly credible, so on my source analysis for those particular sources, I would have a note in there showing that I understand that Wikipedia is not particularly credible. But it's good for background information. It gives you enough information to be able to think of some other questions, some other keywords, and be able to get further information to verify the reliability of the data that you found there. All right, questions arising. I do get very concerned when I don't find a lot of information in this particular section from your source analysis. Whenever you're engaging with a source, it is really important that you are actively engaging in that. All right, it's not about reading and regurgitating. The research project is not that sort of task. You really need to be actively engaging with all of your sources, and in doing that, you should be coming up with a whole lot of questions as you read. As you read things, then naturally you should have questions occurring to you to extend your learning. How does it connect with your research, with other sources, understanding of some things that are happening? All right. So with this particular source, you can see the sorts of questions that I might have come up with in reading that. All right. Bias is really important as well, and it doesn't make your research any more or less valid, but it does give you a specific standpoint from which somebody is speaking. And everyone writes with some bias, okay? Everyone has some bias in the information that they put forward. It's about acknowledging that, and where necessary, actually finding opposing viewpoints to back up and support the information you've found and the reliability of it. So in this particular example, the information that I had from my other sources was that Dr. Seuss actually had strong political opinions and that he put these into a lot of his works. So was this book really about environmentalism and raising the awareness of environmentalism for children, or was it propaganda for the Democratic Party? So it's important that I can stand back and look at that and determine that. So where might I then go with that information is perhaps to find some interviews or articles from the time where he might be speaking about the importance of his work, why he wrote it, what it was supposed to be about, and who for, and the messages behind it. It doesn't mean that this text is any less useful in providing environmental education for children. And in fact, that's quite important to note. But it may not be the reason that he wrote it, and so that might be important to my research. All right, further action from this would be further investigation into his works or beliefs. So if your particular source is a dead end, then you do have to question where it fits in, and at some point things will sort of come to an end as you get some more and more questions. But at this early on, I would think that almost everything has further action to come from it. Evidence, that's going to be the evidence of how I've interacted with this source. So if it's an interview, I might have an audio recording and a transcript which has been written up and annotated. If it's a reading, I might have a printout of that that's highlighted and annotated, has all my notes with it. And for each of those things, I would put them in a separate pocket in my folder with this source reference sheet on the top. So as I'm flicking through, I can see all of my sources, and it's all very clear about where my research has come from and my information and how I've gathered it in order to put together my outcome when I get there. Reliability and validity. So again, you will need to talk about this at all three stages of your research project, and so it is important that you're continually looking at those questions. Reliability, how well are you able to apply the same findings across different scenarios? So if I was doing an experiment myself as the target, would my results be accurate for other people, and if so, which other people? How reliable are my results in terms of if I was to recreate that test at another time or with different people, would I get the same results? All right. And validity, so your very early sources may be very credible and very reliable, but they may not actually be very valid because in your process of question refinement, you may have made changes that make them less valid now. So they were really important in developing your basic understanding of your topic. But in terms of answering your question as it stands now, they may be less valid than they were. And so that doesn't make them any less important to your research, but they may not be so important when it comes to your outcome. And decisions arising. So this is again quite important. You are at different points going to have to look at the decisions that you make in your research. So if I finish with that source and I've got some questions and some things that I want to follow up, but other decisions that I need to make at this point. So if I've done one set of results from a survey, what I might find is that I actually need further information in a particular area. And so I would need to go and undertake an interview. Or I might not fully understand the information that's been given to me, and so I need to go and do further information. The data that I've found doesn't answer my question, and perhaps I need to relook at how I've done that process and redo it again. They would be decisions that I'm making along the way based on the research that I'm undertaking. So again, I would say that if you're really interacting well with your sources, you're often going to have at least one decision arising from that source upon reading it. I am very concerned where I see source reference analysis sheets that really don't show that engagement in a source, and that someone has read it and has had questions arising and has things that they're going to go off and do from that source. I can see that that's something that happens very early on, but as you're now getting into the serious research for your project, I would think that this really needs to become more and more thorough, particularly in those areas of questions that are arising and decisions that you might be making and actions coming from those sources. So I hope that you find that useful in completing a source analysis. As I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't need to look exactly like this one. You can display yours in any way that you like. I would recommend that you can use as many space-saving measures as possible, because you may want to show aspects of it in your folio, and in which case you don't want a lot of white space. And I would also suggest something that you can print out, one analysis to a page to put into each separate pocket in your folder to keep with all of your research as you go. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you found that useful.